Welcome to this very special edition of the Public Finance Podcast. This edition is called New Frontiers, New Elections and the Changing Landscape. In case you hadn't noticed, there's a general election going on at the moment. Now, there's some big issues here, so we've got things like social care, housing, special education needs. They're still to be dealt with. There's public finances, which are under serious pressure, and Whitehall, which is also going to be facing significant changes as well. Added into the mix, we've got some new local and regional players who will be setting out their agendas. While Westminster resets and thinks about what next, is this the opportunity of a lifetime? It could be. Well, here to discuss this with us are two great guests. Joining me first of all is Jessica Studdert, who is Interim Chief Executive of the think tank New Local. Welcome, Jessica.
Hi, very pleased to be here.
Great, thank you. And also joining us is our regular guest, the Chief Executive of Local Government Latco Norths Group, Justin Galliford. Justin, welcome.
Chris, thanks very much. Pleasure as always.
So I think we can safely say that this is the one podcast that you can bet is going to be a compelling listen, surely. Let's get straight down to it. Really, let's start with the general election. And I think the big question that we need to ask is, have you got any bets on Justin?
Well, I have to say, I'm not really a betting man, Chris. So no bets from me.
No bets. Jessica, have you got any tickets lined up with fabulous odds on outcomes?
I don't. I'm also not a betting person.
Well, that's the declarations of interest safely out of the way. What are your thoughts on Jessica? Let's start with you. What are your thoughts on how it's gone, how the main parties have performed? Because it's been interesting. What's happened? Have there been any great ideas that we're all talking about? What's happened to the Red Wall? Is Clacton the future? AI. There's been lots of stuff. What are the key things that stand out for you?
I think general election campaigns are always strange forums, given that we're trying to make long-term serious decisions about the future of our country, certainly over the next 5 years. And it always feels like, with the kind of media looking out for gotcha moments and various leaders needing to kind of navigate their Ming vases across slippery floors, it doesn't always feel like the real issues of the day get a chance to be kind of aired. But I think that, both parties do have a kind of clear manifesto that they've set out, both the main parties, and we've had some kind of particular shocks and surprises. But I think some of the big challenges, some of the big structural challenges, we're an ageing society, we've got deepening poverty and inequality in the country, haven't quite got the airing. So there's always a bit of a sort of a challenge between the short-termism and the necessary soundbite focus of a general election campaign, and then some of the sort of deeper structural challenges that we're facing as a country. I'd say one sort of slight glimmer of interest and hope to that end, though, is...
Well, we love optimism. Go on.
Yeah, well, Labour have been focusing on mission-driven government, which I think is an interesting concept, and they have been talking about it during the campaign, but it's not necessarily that it's kind of made the top of the headline daily news. But I think there are attempts to be looking at sort of not just the what of how you might govern, but also the how, and how we might shift towards a bit more of an approach to kind of long-term investment and thinking about dealing with some of those structural challenges. But I'd agree.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Do you think we're still stuck in this whole kind of, it's tax and spend? We can still have those Scandinavian public services on American levels of taxation. Are we still sort of hovering around that little corner, do you think, Jessica?
It's just been quite a cautious election, hasn't it? I think there's a tendency for the terms of the previous election to kind of define how parties approach the next election. So you mentioned the Red Wall. There's a kind of sense of which constituents both parties are focused on. and not wanting to rock the boat. And I think that, but both have given quite cautious spending plans. We know from organisations like the IFS and analysis there that as current projections look, there will need to be either tax rises or deeper spending cuts. But I think that for both main parties, it's been challenging, actually kind of demonstrating that realism. That you get kind of a difficult airing, and you get a bit of silly politics that has come to the fore around kind of how many thousands of taxes are going to come on families, and you don't really get into the kind of detailed discussion behind that about the nature of demand and the pressures on public services, and how we might need to really refocus our kind of state for the future. Those are all the things that don't come out in an election campaign, but that's not to say they wouldn't come out in the early years of a new government.
I mean, it's always the buyer beware. Go and read those manifestos and check them out for yourself, rather than relying on the mainstream or the legacy media, as the Gen Z commentators will say. So, Justin, what's your thoughts on the campaign? Are we really, are they just cautiously trying desperately not to mess up? Is it just a media airball thing, or have you noticed anything else of interest?
I think in general, the main parties are being cautious. So I'd agree with what you're saying. In many ways, I think that's a shame, because some of the things that aren't being discussed, I think, are really important. And you and I have discussed it before on this podcast. We talk about the need to potentially increase taxes and all those pressures, or make cuts. There's one way to alleviate that pressure, which is grow the economy and increase GDP. And I think it's fundamental. And I think it's a shame that doesn't seem to have been tackled conclusively by any party, in my view. I think there are other pressing issues at time with that. None of the main parties are really addressing climate change. And I think we have to be real about it. We cannot keep kicking that can down the road. We see the impacts now, economically and socially. These things have to be dealt with. I think, as Jessica points out, the other real pressure which no one's talking about is adult social care, and particularly pursuant to local authorities. That pressure is going to grow and grow at a really rapid rate, particularly with an ageing population. And I think it's one to watch over the next few years. Unfortunately, to me, it feels like soundbite politics. Over time, over the last several elections, we seem to have been more Americanised in the nicest way in terms of how elections are run. Of course, we all know you don't actually vote for a prime minister at the polling booths, but that's how these campaigns are run. You want to vote for the person you want to run the country. But of course, that isn't the case at all. So I just think we lack a quality of depth in campaigns, and it's self-debased by, as you said, this kind of air war, this media war. And I think that is unfortunate, because it's taken us away from the fundamental issues people really want to know about.
Jessica, what's your thoughts on the whole social care? Have we come close to even beginning to address the real issues around capacity, skills, who pays for it, and all that kind of stuff?
Oh, absolutely not. And I think that over successive election campaigns, they've proved kind of not incoherent forums for discussing exactly the trade-offs and the investment that's needed for tackling the social care crisis. And both parties have been guilty of kind of throwing around slogans like a death tax or similar on proposals to shift funding. I think, obviously it's the kind of there's no more grass for it to be kicked into. It's been kicked into the long grass successively. There clearly does need to be action. There clearly does need to be some sort of cross-party consensus. And there is a growing movement of people who are outside Westminster who understand the challenge. I think the thing with social care is it can't really be seen in isolation from what's going on with the NHS. It's very much more than just healthcare. It is enabling people to live independent lives, healthier for longer. But you've got the demand challenges that facing the NHS that are sort of seen much more positively, and as much more of a kind of the NHS is a kind of public good that it's okay for politicians to promise more investment in. And social care is the sort of the Cinderella service. I think that can't stand up for much longer, and I think that the next Parliament will have to engage in those challenges and trade-offs. And early on in the parliamentary cycle is exactly the right time to be doing that, so that you begin the kind of long-term work that's needed on that.
But, and I guess, if you ever talk to anybody involved with social care and social care policy, the one thing they all say is just anything but another royal commission. I see Justin here is nodding furiously. Does that feel like we actually need some results rather than let's think about it?
I think the time is coming, Jessica outlines it very well, where somebody needs to take it by the horns and look at a full root and branch review. In today's modern age, if you sat down to devise social care, would you have it standalone away from the NHS? It's just a product of how it's grown up. But as Jessica points out, the NHS is seen as a vote winner, whereas social care is not, because of course social care has a label of social care for the elderly, so you only need it at a certain point in your life. Many people are fairly oblivious to it to a certain degree until the time comes when they really need it, and that's when I find out how complex it is, how difficult it can be, and sometimes how unfair. So I think really we need some drastic action where we review that, and I know we've got ICBs and arguably they've made some good progress, but something far more fundamental needs to happen, because I just don't think the systems can carry on working in isolation as they are, despite that interface with ICB.
It was a very interesting comment in the media in the last recent days about how civil servants are preparing a black swan list for the new government. So the Prime Minister walks into Downing Street, given the seals of office, and he's given the folders with everything that's going on in the world, quite a lot of it not good. And then the head of the civil service will explain out that this black swan list of these are the things that need action now, because if you don't, something will go wrong. So social care is probably one of the things that should be on the list. Let's pretend, both of you, that you're the head of the civil service, and you've got to brief the new Prime Minister on the things they need to think about really quickly. What are the things, 2 or 3, the things that you think really, really should be on that list?
Well, first off, me as the head of the civil service is probably quite a worrying thought for many people, but I appreciate your sentiment. I think certainly from the sphere of work that we're in as a group and what I see, adult social care is on that list. There's no two ways about it. I also think the funding mechanism for local authorities and the ongoing issue around their current use of reserves, really, really important. We know, and the list and the number varies, but there are a number of authorities who are saying, if not now, they will be in significant financial difficulty over the next few years. I think that's important because, of course, local authorities are the doing arm of central government, and for many people, their link with local democracy. And relied on to provide vital services for communities. Slightly outside of our sphere of influence, but some work we do on the fringes. I think the prison service is also facing some major challenges. If you look at its current occupation rate, it's basically full.
Which I believe the prisons minister in the more or less, I think, second from last day, or on the last day of the government, actually said, the prisons are full, which is extraordinary. Jessica, you're going to be the first female head of the civil service. What's going to be in your briefing folder to the Prime Minister in number 10? Justin's
done the core list. I can only sort of add to the different public services that you might add. The university sector is facing huge challenges. There's real kind of viability of that sector. Broader than prisons, the criminal justice system and the kind of backlog in the courts. Challenges with the NHS funding shortfall. I think I'd say 2 things. Firstly, from the perspective of local government, there's a real challenge that what the perception in Whitehall might be is that councils are at risk of failure, and there will be more that are on the brink of issuing Section 114 notices. And there's a challenge that is a kind of that kind of risk then destabilises the whole of the government's and new government's approach to the sector. And actually, it's really easy to get out ahead of that rather than being kind of reactive. I think the worst thing for the local government sector would be that there's a kind of whack-a-mole approach where you're just putting out fires separately rather than actually putting in place a long-term plan for resourcing local public services effectively. And that is then the route to a lot of the other challenges, for example, the knock-on impact on acute services like the police or the NHS for the lack of early intervention and prevention. So I think one of the second thing I'd say is seeing all these different public service crises in isolation, rather than as a kind of collective systemic challenge of demand facing the way our public sector is set up and resourced. That's going to be the challenge. And at New Local, we've been developing a lot more of a focus around place-based public services and kind of place-based collaboration and reform. Lots of people working in different parts of the public sector locally will realise that collaboration and integration is absolutely part of the solution to the challenges facing our public services, and linking what's going on and what's funded and invested much more with community needs and priority is a real solution. So I think one of the risks is there's a sort of firefighting crisis reaction stance rather than a more kind of holistic agenda for how we're actually orienting how public services are invested in to meet the challenges of the mid-2020s.
Kind of government department that oversees all of the overarching work, the coordination, is really the Cabinet Office. So is it time that we rethink the role of the centre to actually focus on place and bring all of that together? Presumably some sort of action's got to happen, because we have got now these regional mayors. So the system as is actually isn't, within the next 2 or 3 years, is probably going to come up against some sort of a collision point with those mayors, aren't they, Jessica?
I think with the devolution sort of policy to date, we've had a sort of an asymmetric approach, that half the country covered by devo deals and half not. And that powers of mayors focused on growth and public services largely separate to that, and still run from the centre in different ways. So I think there is a real opportunity to kind of catalyse a bit quicker, a much more coherent approach to what's done nationally at Whitehall, what's done kind of sub-regionally at combined authority level, and clarify, importantly, then the role of local authorities within that, and that kind of much more local and hyper-local approach to working with communities. At the moment, it's all a bit ad hoc, kind of the question, mayor's going to be the kind of the new tier that is the focus of new powers. Does it go beyond mayors? Does it reach into communities in different ways? I think there's a lot still to be determined about how devolution evolves as an agenda, but certainly Whitehall reform, I think, would be kind of up there as a priority, because it still is structured in a way that reinforces those silos, and that siloed working in places and that kind of accountability back up the system, often on a place level, is what's kind of creating a bit of fragmentation and lack of impact for resource spent. And that's where I would say that the kind of Labour's exploration of what mission-led government might mean in practice is interesting. I think there's a lot to be worked through what that means in practice, but that cross-departmental working and that kind of joined-up approach is really what's going to be necessary to meet the kind of complexity of those challenges, and then crucially how Whitehall interfaces with places, and understands that actually a lot of the route to resolving a lot of this is to kind of enable partners to work much more effectively together. So I think it can be a potentially exciting time. Obviously, there is a funding challenge, but there's also a kind of reform opportunity, I think, within that.
We've got this ancient setup with the counties out, we're very London-centric, which is something else I've noticed with the election campaign. We are still very, very London-focused. You get out to, go somewhere like sort of Northumberland or something. It's a very different environment, How does all of this stuff play out when you're well away from Whitehall, Justin?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. We need to find a far better way of communicating between central government and local government. It's been a systemic challenge for many governments. Arguably, devolution's helping with that, but I think it has a long way to go. And I think if you consider that concept, along with, as has been discussed, a more of a multidisciplinary approach to how services can operate, you stand some chance of really broadening that conversation out into a set of objectives that really help deliver on a manifesto. But I also have to acknowledge over various previous governments, that hasn't been achieved. So we are talking about something substantially different to what we've seen certainly over the last 10, 20, 30 years.
Surely the point where all of this starts to change is, there's going to be a new Chancellor. At some point there'll either be like a spending review or a budget statement or something. Is that the moment where, that's the point where it gets traction and it either does or doesn't happen? The Chancellor says, here we go, we're changing how funding goes out to those regional and local levels of government. Jessica, do you think that's more certain or less, or actually there's a different way of achieving those ends?
I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the challenges with kind of national policy making is that there's a tendency to focus on creating new structures as a route to impact, rather than looking at finances and how the funding flows create different incentives for different behaviours. So, for example, you can really easily invent a new structure and a new body that, because you've kind of conjured it out of nowhere, you can it's perfect. It can do everything that you think is currently missing in the current system, and all your kind of hopes and dreams for future reform can kind of lie there. When those structures come into reality, they obviously fall short in different ways. And I think we've seen that over the years with things like LEPs being created and various waves of NHS reform where different structures have been kind of created and disbanded, but the fundamental challenge kind of still exists. So one thing on structures, I think, is working within the structures you have. So from a local government perspective, I'm always really keen on working through local government, local authorities, rather than creating structures that bypass them. But from the perspective of how funding works and flows into places, one idea that New Local have been advocating is a return to some of the principles around the total place pilots that happened at the end of the last Labour government, which looked at the totality of all public spending in a place, coming through different public services and different agencies. And if you could understand that in total, and then understand how money was being spent like inefficiently or ineffectively on similar challenges or similar cohorts of the population, actually then you could begin to use that as a way of collaborating and aligning that spend much more effectively across public service partners, and maybe even creating business cases for investing in prevention and different ways of working. So I think that that's got a lot of mileage for the current era, where there isn't easily lots of new funding around, but certainly there's a real motivator to look at some of the inefficiencies in the current system. And certainly that siloed approach on the ground, I mean, a lot of people would say from different parts of the system, different agencies are working on very often the same families or the same kind of population groups, same neighbourhoods. So there is kind of much more effectiveness and impact that can potentially be sought from really developing place-based working. And that's about the financial incentives within the system rather than a new sort of structure that you'd append onto the existing system.
Well, that's a daring idea. I mean, there's on one side there's the common sense of getting people to work better together, but Justin, I mean, is there inefficiency in public? Everybody says there's no money left. We've tens of thousands of jobs have been cut. Organisations have rowed back on provisions. So this idea that somehow there is still inefficiency in the system. I mean, that's quite a radical idea, but also be one that if you're a public sector leader on, say, for example, some of the unions would be aghast at. I mean, is that still possible after 14 years of austerity?
Well, I think, as Jessica says, you really got to stand back and look at how those different funds are flowing to an area, because I think potentially that's where you might find not so much an inefficiency, but it's about how that money's distributed, and maybe it could be distributed better. When we think about the example I gave earlier of adult social care and the NHS, ICBs are kind of working between those. One would assume if it was better integrated, as an example, you may get more efficient use of money. So I think that kind of concept is really important. That's where I think this co-design, this redesign of services could deliver further efficiency and further value.
There's inefficiencies within single services, which has been a priority actually for both political parties. Have said that their main approach to existing public services is to create productivity drives and try to squeeze out productivity gains within single services, treating sort of local government separately to health and separately to other services. That's where there is no slack within the system to drive out, and where services under austerity have faced huge pressures to cut back. What I'm talking about is ineffective use of public money across the system, because that lack of integration and collaboration across services is leading to knock-on effects. So, for example, withdrawing local government funding has created arguably kind of knock-on effects on the health service, on acute response services like the police, so lack of mental health provision. There's all sorts of kind of knock-on effects and costs created within the system by seeing services simply as siloed and separate to each other. So it's not to say that there's an easy kind of productivity drive and efficiency initiative that you could catalyse. That would be the worst outcome for future public service thinking. It's actually about understanding how effective and more impactful that collaboration across the place can be, and that's radical from the Whitehall perspective, because it's very much set up to see health, housing, local government, education as separate domains that kind of exist in parallel rather than together.
Yeah, keeping it simple at the top sort of works, but actually it really doesn't. I mean, the flip of this, though, also is we've seen, particularly in the last 2 years, is the issue around, if you like, the kind of management capacity of some local organisations. So, for example, some of the councils that issued Section 114 notices, there were some things going on in there that really shouldn't have been, and there's some question marks there around, you have this big change coming down the line, and whether or not those organisations have actually got the capacity to, you're only as strong as the weakest part of that chain, and it could be the police, it could be the NHS, it might be the local authority, but in any given place there's going to be one part that just hasn't got the capacity to deliver. How do you sort of deal with that one?
Well, I mean, you hear about lack of capacity. Of course, there's different ways in which all public services have kind of retrenched, but I would just say that's not an innate quantity. There's lack of capacity has been driven down, and it can be built back up. So I worry sometimes, particularly when the kind of term lack of capacity is used with reference to local government. It sometimes can be used as if that's just a kind of evergreen fact, and therefore we need to kind of invest in combined authorities or other kind of, as I say, other structures, not local government. Actually, we just need to find ways of increasing capacity and increasing investment and making, the kind of, financial terms, the business case for investing in communities, which then reduces demand in different ways on very expensive crisis response services and acute hospital pressures that we're currently facing. So I would be worried about lack of capacity then becoming a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, that we're then not thinking about how to overturn a situation that has built up over years.
There's rumours that the new government is looking at top slicing some funding to sort of write off the debts and that then, quickly as possible put some of those local authorities right. I mean, there's an issue here around, does that mean that those organisations got away with it? Or, is that adds sort of another sense of like, it's the too big to fail thing. The government will come in and sort out it. Have we got to also really think about, if we're going to do place and if we're going to give these organisations the powers to actually work together and do and deliver, some things around scrutiny and what happens when it goes wrong, Justin? I
mean, I think a trend we're going to see over the next 5 years or so is an evolution of scrutiny. There's always been scrutiny in the public sector, but I think we'll just see more of that in light of some of the challenges that some authorities have faced. I think to say the suggestion that perhaps some authorities are kind of bailed out, as it was put, I think you've got to look at it a bit more widely than that. Ultimately we know that a local authority can't go bust. So it always has that protection there. It's just a different set of measures are brought in to help it get back to where it needs to. You could argue with a slight variation, it's kind of one and the same thing. Ultimately, these public authorities exist as local authorities to create place and help communities thrive, and that has to continue. So I think if there's a pragmatic decision to help adjust their books and get them straight so they can move on, that has to be a good thing. I think there's little to be gained other than a quick reflection on what we do better across the board. You just have to move on, otherwise you're kind of caught in the past. And you have to say that quite often in such circumstances, new people join the authority to help move it forward, and those people have to be able to drive things forward. They can't be caught in the past. So I think it's really important to take a pragmatic view and quite simply move on.
Is a lot of this about being pragmatic, what can be done, who can do it, and also is this thing around, okay, there's been a problem, so we just deal with it in a way that's best for those communities, so that the people who are living there aren't saddled with something for generations to come. Is it we've just got to be more realistic about what's in front of us?
I mean, there are a couple of different issues there. One is the specific circumstances of authorities that have kind of gone bust, so we say, and whether the implication of that and the kind of consequences of that being increases in council tax on residents who haven't had just happened to live there rather than have been part of it. And as Justin says, those councils as bodies then do go through a period of introspection and understanding how they kind of move forward with the community in different ways. And so it's not that they've kind of, I think it's a bit too trite to say they've kind of got away with it. But we've got to learn from failure. We've got to be better about learning from failure and also reflect on some of the contextual factors that kind of lay behind some of the decisions that were made in councils. And I think one of the challenges at the moment is there's just no room for councils are absolutely kind of, there's no room for anything to go, as soon as one misstep happens, there's nowhere for them to move. And we've kind of created such fragility and vulnerability systemically in the sector that that there are questions at a deeper level to be asking about what level of risk we're passing down to local authorities. So I'm very keen to separate those sort of isolated councils from what's going on in the rest of the sector. But the fundamental challenge is they're not funded to the extent of the demand challenges that they're facing across special educational needs, across homelessness, across social care budget, and we've got to kind of talk more fundamentally about how services for some of the most kind of vulnerable groups in society, but some where we really do feel there should be a safety net, how that's resourced effectively. And I think it's always sort of unhelpful to be kind of focusing on some of the higher profile failures and to an extent that detracts from those systemic challenges.
It's as much Whitehall's problem as the sort of the local, the local symptom is part of the Whitehall responsibility, as it were, you think? I think,
there are particular circumstances in investment decisions in places like Woking and Thurrock that are particular to those authorities. But I think more generally, the wider trend is to increasing numbers of councils either declaring or projecting that they will in future years need to declare a Section 114. And I think we can't now consider these isolated.
They're not one-offs.
Yeah, exactly. We've got to start asking some more fundamental questions about the fragility that's being required of the sector to function within. It takes an enormous toll on workforce and kind of senior leadership within councils. There's an enormous toll on the workforce that is an under-recognised factor behind all of this. I think if you asked if you stood back to take a look at, what we're requiring councils to do and how they're resourced to do it, there's a fundamental mismatch which is unavoidable, and those symptoms will keep manifesting themselves as councils going bust. But there's actually a deeper problem there that definitely needs addressing.
And I'm going to dare to sort of maybe strike a note of optimism in all of this. If you was to sort of go forward to 12 months' time, so a year on from the new government, what do you think that local government, if you like, that ecosystem, what do you think it's going to look like? Given we'd have had some changes, Whitehall will have shifted a bit, circumstances might have changed, interest rates down, on all of that stuff. If you're going to do some forecasting looking ahead, Justin, what do you think you might see?
I think there's a possibility that we're going to see multi-year settlement funding deals for local authorities, which I think will be very welcome. But I think that's the start of a journey. But if we're just talking about 12 months, that is probably the single biggest. But I have to say, I also still think that some of the pressures already talked about, and in particular adult social services and SEND, along with housing, which we haven't really talked about, are going to be huge pressures, which I fear may not be resolved.
In a year's time, what do you think we're going to be staring at, or is it? Will we just be starting to get to grips with some of these issues, like, say, for example, housing? What are your thoughts?
Oh, well, I think you're quite right to challenge me on a bit of optimism, because I think it is very easy to look at how hard everything all is. And there's no doubt that there are challenges that will, the inbox of the next government is not going to be pretty reading. But I think there is an opportunity for a kind of much more fundamental reset of looking at the way we invest in goods in this country, the way we make public investment, the way we require public services to work together in places, and the changing kind of nature of demographic need and demand, for example, our ageing population. So I would hope that in a year's time, some of the kind of some irons have been put in the fire, as it were, that we've begun the journey of trying to address what will be generational shift. But I think that we do need to understand the gravity of the situation, and I think to an extent what's happening at the moment is we're just putting out different fires separately, and in a quite a short-term reactive footing. So governments over recent years have announced new pots of funding here, there and everywhere, but they're always reactive. And I think that what we need to do is, as Justin says, we potentially are looking at multi-year funding settlements, which would give a degree of stability and security that partners can kind of plan around in the longer term. But I think we just need to make that sort of system shift towards longer term assurance and focus on future challenges. So I would love to then look forward to 10 years' time that some of those harder decisions have begun to pay off, and we've shifted at least the balance of what we're spending towards kind of community-led prevention and not just a kind of reactive model of public services, and beginning to look at new models of sort of housing delivery that meet community needs. So I do have every confidence that can happen. It just is going to take some kind of political determination and will.
I thought if there's one thing from the general election campaign or sort of last 14 years or things that you've seen in the manifestos or stuff you heard on the TV and gone, wow, I'm really not sure about this. So if there is a one moment, a policy, an event or something that you can donate to, and I'm going to call it the National Museum of Things That Probably Won't Fly. If there's anything over the recent few weeks that you've looked at and thought, no, I can't see that working. Is there something, Jessica, that you'd like to donate to that museum?
When you ask that question, I can't help but look at this kind of national service idea for young people, which just seemed to really jar with the kind of intergenerational challenges that we've got in this country, and young people who have grown up under the shadow of COVID suddenly being kind of required to then be put to
turn up at the recruiting hall and
and I guess what's funny about that is you can sort of see the sort of civic mindedness, and how do we develop a sense of kind of stake and community and there's really positive things underneath it, but it just kind of landed so atrociously because there's just so many challenges for young people and so few kind of glimmers of hope where their needs around housing or climate change and things like that are just are not really credibly being looked at. So yeah, that for me that would be
That's your nomination. Justin, have you got a what would you're going to donate one thing to the National Museum of Things That Probably Won't Fly? Is there something that you that sticks out for you?
Well, I have to say, I think Jessica's sort of stolen it, really. I mean, I think that's probably one to stick out for everybody. I think as a point of policy on reflection, how might it have worked better is quite an interesting one. And maybe if there's a mandate that says young people will stay in education till they're 18, perhaps that could have been an option for them. If you don't want to stay in education, you could do this instead, maybe. But I think most people would probably acknowledge it's quite hard to beat that policy as one that really didn't seem to land well with anyone.
Well, I have to say that it's a democracy, so therefore we have to go with the will of the people. So both of you, we are donating the idea of national service to the Museum of Things That Probably Won't Fly. And on that, well, there you go. What a note to end on. I think it only leaves me to thank our guest, Jessica Studdert from New Local. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
And it also just to thank Justin Galliford, Chief Executive of Norse Group, for also joining us. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.
Well, if you haven't already, there's on election night, there'll be plenty of hours between the polls closing and the results being announced. So what better way to spend that time than listening to the previous editions of this podcast, which you can find on the internet. The only thing left to do is to say thank you very much indeed to all of you for joining us. And we hope that you'll join us again. Thank you and goodbye.